and get started with our webinar this afternoon. Thanks everybody for attending. If you have questions, you can either use the Q&A box there on your screen, or otherwise you can also use the chat feature. Remember, if you're using the chat feature and it's something that you want everyone to see, not just the panelists, make sure that you click all the panelists and all attendees. With that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. Molly Kaplan is our current homicide prevention coordinator. Prior to this role, she served as our domestic violence high-risk team coordinator, working with the City of Cleveland Districts 1 and 5 to help work on providing services for folks and survivors that were at more high risk. So I will go ahead and let her get started.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We only have a half hour today, so I want to really make sure that we get through the information. But certainly, if you have questions, please utilize that QA box in the chat box. Megan's going to help kind of monitor that, and so anything you want, answered, go ahead and put in there. So we're a domestic violence and child advocacy center. So we've been in the community Greater Cleveland for about 40 years. We provide a variety of services, which we'll talk about at the end. So this is a pretty heavy topic as we talk about domestic violence lethality. Domestic violence in general is a tough topic that we talk about. Maybe you have your own personal experience, maybe a friend or family member. But when we start to talk about intimate partner homicide, it gets even extra heavy. So make sure you take some time after this webinar. If you need to jump off midway, we're not offended. We understand that this is a tough topic. So just to provide a little bit of background, intimate partner homicide disproportionately impacts women. So we know that women are far more likely to be victims of homicide-suicide. And about half of female homicide victims in the US are killed by a current or former male partner. And that's in comparison to a smaller portion of male homicide victims who are killed by a partner. In an average month, about 50 women are shot to death by intimate partners. So this is a problem in our community. This is a problem across the country. And it's something that as we've sort of understood a little bit more about, we are able to talk about risk factors and things like that. So the major risk factor for intimate partner homicide, no matter if a male or female partner is killed, is that history of domestic violence. So those who are in an abusive relationship are already sort of at that elevated risk of homicide. And we know that all people experience intimate partner violence. So all races, ethnicities, age, it's all, kind of across the board. It crosses socioeconomic lines. But what we know is that the burden of relationship violence is not shared equally by all people and all women. So women of color and those who are immigrants or refugees are overrepresented among those that experience severe domestic violence and domestic violence related homicides. And so when we talk about intimate partner homicides, we know that there is this group of women that are at higher risk than others. So in particular, one stat that I just find to be so shocking is that young Black women, it's the 18 to 34 range, are nearly 3 times more likely to be shot and killed by an intimate partner than white women in the same age group. My background is public health, so I'm a stats nerd. So you'll see a lot of that sort of peppered in through this this presentation. But this is just something to really demonstrate that disproportionate impact that we see. So of course, anytime someone is killed in an intimate partner homicide event, it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy for that family, for any children that were involved, for the community. We've had some really horrific situations recently in Cleveland. Last summer, there was an intimate partner homicide event where the partner killed their primary victim, killed children, and also killed a neighbor that was sort of trying to intervene. And so we know that when these things happen, they have significant impacts on our community. So 20% of the time, people other than that primary victim are also killed. So this could be a new partner, it could be family members, children, police officers. These are very dangerous calls for police officers. And so when we talk about, this community impact, it goes so much farther than just the victim that is killed. There's also this really alarming trend. If you start to look into mass shootings in the US, so anytime the news reports on it, they're doing a little bit better job of sort of making these connections with history of domestic violence. So what we're finding, which is extremely disturbing, is that there's this close connection with mass shootings and domestic violence. So in about 20% of mass shootings, the perpetrator had previously been charged with domestic violence. This is actually really an underestimate because we know that there's a significant amount of people who were maybe had perpetrated domestic violence but weren't necessarily charged. And then 54%, the perpetrator killed an intimate partner or family member in the mass shooting. And so this is often their primary target. And then there are these other people that also die in this incident. One of them that really jumps to mind is there was a mass shooting at a church, and the perpetrator, it was the church where his partner's family went. And so it was really targeted at the family and the intimate partner, and then also killed others in that. So also troubling for us is that we're seeing that intimate partner homicides are now on the rise. So we had seen this decline kind of consistently over a few decades, but now we're really seeing intimate partner homicides on the rise. Some of that is connected to firearm homicides. But what we're really concerned about is that we are expecting to see an uptick of intimate partner homicides following stay-at-home orders, kind of in the midst of COVID-19. So we know that abuse is escalating, and so there is some concern that we're going to see an increase in homicides following or while the pandemic is happening. So when we talk about assessing risk for lethality, so I think in the past there was this sort of perception of intimate partner homicides that there was nothing that we could do. So sometimes the media would report it like this person just snapped, or they lost their job and they, their life was falling apart and so they just snapped. And what we find to be actually the case is that there is a pattern. So the escalation of domestic violence to a lethal level follows an identifiable pattern with identifiable indicators. So cases that typically end in homicide typically fall into this distinct pattern, and we'll sort of talk about that as we go through. And so what this tells us is that these cases are not this instance of just snapping, that there's no way for us to know when or if, sorry, I saw that there's a little bit of sound issue. I'll try to move my laptop just a little bit closer. So what research over the past few decades has shown is that there are risk factors attributed to lethal domestic violence. And so if there is this pattern, if there are these risk factors, then that means that they're predictable, that there are cases that we can look at and say, this case is really at risk for homicide. What can we do about it? So there's this little bit of prevention there. So if we can predict which cases are going to escalate to homicide, that gives us some ability to prevent them. So research has indicated red flags, and that's what we're really going to focus on today, are those red flags. What I want to do is just have a little bit of a pause to say that there's absolutely no absolutes. So there are always going to be cases where there is no pattern, there are no risk factors, and this intimate partner homicide still occurred. And then there are going to be cases where every single red flag was present and it will not result in a homicide. So we just have to know that there's no absolutes here. Some cases fall outside of these patterns, but most DV homicides, when you really dig in and look at the situation, they fall into this pattern. So For those that are familiar with the danger assessment, the danger assessment was created by Dr. Jacqueline Campbell. She's at Johns Hopkins University. She actually started as an ER nurse, and where this sort of overlaps is that, as you know, victims often report to emergency rooms after an incident of domestic violence. And so what they found was that, victims are often not totally aware of the risk that they're in. And so what they wanted to do was really create a place where we can have a conversation with victims about their risk for homicide. And so what's up on screen are 19 red flags that have been found in research to be associated with domestic violence homicide. So these are those red flags that we're talking about. So they're kind of separated into those that are obvious. So that left column, it's sort of an obvious risk factor. So we see increasing severity of physical violence. There's threats, there's use of weapons, there's a gun. And so when we start to see those things, those are kind of obvious to us. But on that right side, these might be the ones that seem a little bit not so clear. So the ones in blue, we're going to go through these kind of more specifically. Not only are these really very important risk factors, but these are those that during COVID-19 and during the pandemic, we really are needing to consider and really think about how things are changing for victims. So the first one are guns. So we know that gun sales have gone up. So during the pandemic, more people have gone out and purchased guns. And so this is a concern because we know that it's so closely linked with intimate partner homicide. So firearms are most frequently used by abusers to threaten and control their victims, even if the offender never pulls the trigger. And so we know that just that presence of a gun causes fear. It makes a victim easier to control when there is that constant presence of a gun. And so about 4.5 million American women alive today have been threatened by a gun or with a gun by an intimate partner. And about 1 million women have been shot or shot at by an intimate partner. So again, we know that when this gun is present in the home, it really escalates the abuse that is occurring. And so when we talk about this connection with homicide, guns and domestic violence are a deadly combination. So the presence of a gun in a DV situation makes it 5 times more likely that a woman will be killed. So when we talk about risk factors, when you talk with a client and you hear, the presence of a gun, we really have to do some safety planning around that. If the case is sort of navigating the court system, we really have to talk about firearm surrender and whether or not that person is even allowed to own a weapon. If they have previous convictions, they may be possessing that gun illegally. So we really have to talk about guns. Female intimate partners are more likely to be murdered with a firearm than all other means combined. So again, guns are just this ever-present risk when we talk about lethality. Strangulation. So we have heard from a lot of our advocates that there have been more reports of episodes of strangulation. So strangulation is a really sort of missed opportunity that we've had in terms of identifying risk factors. So not really until recently was it really identified as being a serious risk factor for homicide. You often will have clients report it to you as choking. However, choking is really, we can use that, convert that language with clients, but strangulation is really what's happening. So more on strangulation. So victims of a prior strangulation are 7.5 times more likely to be killed by their partner. And so when they looked at the research of intimate partner homicides and really were trying to pull these risk factors out, they found that nearly half of victims were strangled in the year prior to the homicide. And so we don't often fully understand the impact of strangulation or its significance for lethality. But we know that victims of strangulation are at a higher risk of being killed than those who aren't strangled. And so these are some of our most dangerous cases. So the most dangerous DV offenders strangle their victims. This is also a really pivotal moment. If you think about strangulation and the crime, it's a very intimate crime. You have to be very close to someone to strangle them. If you have a gun, you can shoot them from across the room, but to strangle someone, you have to be really up close and personal. And that's also, you think about just that act of strangulation. It's really power and control sort of demonstrated. That abuser has the power and control to control whether that person takes another breath. They hold the power of whether that person lives or dies in their hands. And so when we think about this, it's a strong link to homicide. This is also a really very scary crime. Again, if you think about that intimate nature of it and not being able to breathe and all of those things, what a scary situation this is for clients. So when we talk about strangulation on the violence spectrum, it's really, we're sort of looking at it as a field of the last stop before homicide. If you think about, it's harder to kill someone with a slap or a punch, but it's very easy to kill someone by strangling them. And so when we're looking at this, and it doesn't take very long, just seconds to cause unconsciousness, less than a minute for that person to die. So when we look at cases, we know that repeated strangulation and strangulation to unconsciousness are especially associated with near lethality. But what's so scary about this is that there's often no visible injury. And this is why it's been minimized for so long, because when we don't have injury to see, it's often easy to not necessarily understand how significant it is. When they did a study in San Diego, they looked at 300 cases of strangulation in the district attorney's office. Only 15% of them had injuries significant enough to photograph. So again, if you think about, it's hard for us to maybe, we need a lot of visuals. We're visual people. And so if we don't have those visuals, often it's easy for us to kind of downplay what's happening. But we know it can cause short-term and long-term injuries. So neck pain, trouble swallowing, loss of consciousness, incontinence. Some clients might report that they peed themselves, during this instance of strangulation. But longer term, we can have vision, hearing changes, PTSD, memory loss, seizures, traumatic brain injury. So it's a really serious crime. So if you're working with someone who reports a strangulation incident, we really need to refer them to medical care. So if this has happened recently in the last, I would say 72 hours, that is an automatic referral to medical care. Because even if you can't see anything on the outside, they could have life-threatening internal injuries, and there can even be instances of delayed fatality, where because of what's happening inside, that person goes on to die, 1 to 2 days later. But again, these are some of our most dangerous cases, but yet Ohio is one of only 2 states left that has no strangulation legislation in place. So when we talk about needing to take these cases seriously, we're often limited in how we can do that. So separation and leaving. So now that stay-at-home orders are lifting, are victims going to start to take steps to leave their abuser? Are you encouraging people to leave the relationship now that things are sort of starting to open back up? But what we know about leaving is that it's not always the answer. So victims leave when they're ready and they leave when it's safe. But what's important to know about leaving is that it's actually the most dangerous time. So victims are most at risk for homicide from an abusive partner when they're leaving or engaging in legal separation. So this could be physically packing bags, heading out the door, moving somewhere else, or this could look like starting the divorce procedures or filing for a protection order. So when we have clients that want to leave and we are talking with people about leaving, we really have to talk about safety planning. So when that victim is ready and when it's the right time for them, it's really about putting in some measures for safety. So the most dangerous time for leaving is the first 3 months. So we kind of call that the danger window. And if you think about what's happening in those first 3 months, there could be a court case, they could be going to file for divorce, they could be getting a protection order. And so there's a lot happening in that first 3 months. And then the good news is that risk for homicide diminishes over the length of separation. So if you ever read an article about someone who was killed in an intimate partner homicide event, you'll often see that it's during this danger window. They moved out, they filed for divorce, they called police, there was a court case, there are those things happening. We also need to take into consideration some of these other risk factors. So increasing severity of abuse. So during the pandemic, we know that our people already in abusive situations are likely facing more extreme abuse with limited options for support and escape. And then extreme control of daily activities. So control is really pivotal to domestic violence, and abusers really use that and have that coercive control with their victim. But social distancing is making that so much easier when that person has less places to go to access help or less places to go for support. This extreme control is made so much easier. Unemployment. So we know unemployment is a risk for homicide. And we know that right now we've had really high levels of individuals applying for unemployment. And we also hear from economists that it might take some time for the economy to fully bounce back. And so again, we have to think about how this is all sort of intersectioning with the pandemic. Avoiding arrest for domestic violence is a risk for homicide. This is a tough one right now because so many victims may not want to call or can't call police in the situation that they're in. There is consideration too that, if I call the police and my partner goes to jail, what if they're exposed to COVID while they're there and then they come back to the house? And so there's a lot of considerations that we need to think about when we think about avoiding arrest for DV. There are also some police departments that are more hesitant to arrest now than they were before because, again, they're trying to sort of keep people out of jail because we know that, that's not a good public health place to be in a small confined space. And so there is this concern here with avoiding arrest. And then lastly, substance use. So alcohol sales went up during stay-at-home orders. Now bars and restaurants are starting to open back up. And we know that stress, uncertainty, all of those things could cause higher levels of substance use. Now, while substance use is never the cause of violence, it certainly escalates abuse and violence that is already occurring. And so again, when we have someone who's an alcoholic or a problem drinker or someone who uses illegal drugs, that victim is more at risk. So why is it important to talk about risk factors? So these are cases that are known to us, which means that we have some opportunity for intervention. So the majority of victims or perpetrators in these homicide events had contact with the criminal justice or healthcare agency in the year prior to the homicide. So that means over 80% of them talked to someone at a hospital or talked to an advocate at one point, or the offender was in the criminal justice system. And then about 44% of abusers were arrested and a third of victims contacted the police. So again, these are cases that are touching the system that we often see in front of us, and so that gives us an opportunity to do intervention. But most importantly, it's absolutely critical that we're raising victims' awareness of risk. So we know that research has found that victims are more likely to underestimate than overestimate their risk. And that's for a variety of reasons. If you think about it, victims are just trying to get through the day, take care of their kids, go to work. And so they're often more likely to underestimate. So it's our job as advocates to really help raise their awareness about risk. And we also know that safety concerns motivate help-seeking behaviors. And so they may be more likely to get a protection order or work with an advocate or look for other housing if they know the risk that they're in. They also did some research about the danger assessment itself, and women who completed the danger assessment were more likely to seek help from police and or shelter services. And so when we talk about taking protective actions, it's giving victims the information, the education about what's happening and what we know from research, and then letting them make the decision about what they need to do for their safety. But we know that engagement serves as a protective factor. So only a very small percentage of victims that were killed in a DV incident had access to helpline or a shelter in the year prior. And so again, when we look at how we can intervene and really keep victims safe, it's really about engaging them in the services that are available. And lastly, it's important for us to understand the severity of the situation. Now that you're more familiar with risk factors, as someone tells you their story, you might start to see those red flags in your head. You know, the person's unemployed, they used drugs, the person just moved out, they were strangled last week. And so as these red flags start to kind of come out to you in someone's story, we're really able to better understand the severity. This means that we need to do proactive safety planning. So when we hear these red flags, when we know this client is at risk, again, we're giving that information to the victim and then also helping them plan for safety. And then for the cases that reach the criminal justice system, it's the opportunity for the system to respond accordingly, really making sure we're holding the offender accountable. Cases where there are a lot of red flags, we need to take those into consideration with charging and pleas. We know that there's a conversation about criminal justice reform and bond. But when we have a case that is most at risk, it really helps us identify these are the cases we should be using our limited resources for. These are the cases we should be arguing high bond. These are the cases that we should look at sentencing and supervision levels, making sure we're following through when the victim reports a probation violation or they have a protection order and they call police on a violation of that order. These are the cases we really need to make sure the system's responding accordingly. So that was a ton of information in a half hour. I've been through hour-long trainings just for strangulation, just for firearms. So I know that this is a lot thrown at you, but we have a couple minutes. So if you have any questions, make sure you put those in the chat box or the QA box. And then if you want to share with the group, what are some other ways that you can think of to use risk factor information? What are some other ways that you think it's important that we're using, you know, what we identify as high risk, these red flags that we see, what's important and how other ways can we use that? All right, we have a fairly quiet group. That's totally fine. I know we really flew through this information. And like I said, you know, there are always longer trainings. And if you ever see a Strangulation Institute training in your community, I really highly recommend that you sign up and you go. Strangulation we just covered the very tip of the iceberg. And so I really think, you know, it's important if you see any additional training. Let's see, I see one thing in the chat box. I'm gonna look at it. Yeah, so Pamela says it's really important that we remember to hold the perpetrator accountable for his or her actions. Absolutely, and I think that, you know, often we put so much burden on the victim to take steps to be safe. And unfortunately, that's sort of oftentimes, you know, where the focus is. But yeah, we absolutely need to hold that perpetrator accountable. They are making this choice to use violence and control in what's supposed to be a loving relationship. And so I really think as, you know, as it goes through divorces or child custody or criminal cases, children and family services, it's really important that we're focusing that accountability on the perpetrator. Because again, they're the ones making this choice to use violence. Yeah, so someone mentioned Aisha's Law. I'm glad you bring that up. So Aisha's Law just passed out of the House this week or late last week. And so for those not familiar, I encourage you to look up some language about Aisha's Law. So Aisha's Law is going to address some of the things that we talked about. So Ohio, as I mentioned, is one of the last 2 states to not have any legislation on strangulation. So there's going to be, Aisha's Law includes some of the strangulation language. It's also going to train law enforcement to do a risk assessment on scene of domestic violence calls, which is great. That's actually a project that I'm currently working on, is helping some police departments on the east side implement risk assessment. And so there are going to be some, good potential things coming out of Aisha's Law, which of course is named in memory of Aisha Frazier. And the last one, so Pamela says, I work at DCFS and a lot of our case planning language is really damning for the survivor. So it really breaks my heart to hear that. But I think that gives us a really good opportunity to talk about how can we change that? How can we modify case planning to take the focus away from the victim and make sure that that offender is being held accountable for what they're doing and their role in this. I think Children and Family Services is often at odds with DV sort of language, and so more partnership, really working together to build something that is supportive for survivors. Yeah, someone else asked about the link to specific risk assessments. So there's a lot of different risk assessments out there, but the one that I, sort of pulled the risk assessment information from is the danger assessment, and that's that one that Dr. Campbell created from Johns Hopkins. It's actually publicly available on dangerassessment.org. And so if you would like to look at the danger assessment, head to dangerassessment.org, and the tool is up there. We actually use the danger assessment at DVCAC, so every client that we work with, we administer the danger assessment with. Okay, the last one is, I'm a home visiting RN and screen for DV, but find it challenging to get patients to engage with services. Any advice? Yeah, so this is challenging, and I think especially with clients who we worry about. So we hear what they're saying, we hear their story, we maybe see injury, we read their medical history, we are concerned because we know, the risk that they're in. So I think my advice would be to just have a conversation with the client in a really non-judgmental way. So can you tell me what's happening? And then really giving that information back to them. So based on what you're telling me, I'm really concerned for your safety. From what I know about domestic violence, it sounds like you're in a really dangerous situation. And so I think all you can do is really listen, be a support for them, give them the information, and then provide them referrals and say, this place, I know they work with individuals and can provide support and services. So when you're ready, I really, hope that you'll call. I think it's about keeping the door open. It's about survivors and victims, they access services when they're ready and when it's safe to do that. And so we really just have to be, an open door for them, a source of support, a listening ear. And sometimes, unfortunately, that's, all we can do. All right, so that brings us to the end of our time. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know this is really quick, but please reach out to Megan if you have any additional questions or anything that you would like, training in the future. And as she said, we'll be sending out one particular strangulation resource that I find very helpful, and hopefully you will be able to use it in your work. So thank you so much.